Is it really happening? Can you guys see me now? I think it's happening. What's up, grade school? What's going on? I'm going to be honest with you. I'm a little flustered. I'm a little aggravated. I've been fighting technology for like the last 20 minutes, and that's not my normal relationship with technology. I usually feel like the machines and I have an understanding, and I feel that they've betrayed me this morning. But that's a personal issue. Don't worry. I'm working through it. I'm seeking help for it. Good morning, everybody. How are you? Gadali, are you still here with me, buddy?
I am still here.
Yeah, buddy. Cool. Hope you guys are all doing awesome. Let me see if my control room and all that stuff is like ready to go. Okay, it is. We can have grade school after all. It was starting to feel like we weren't going to be able to. So glad the gremlins have been disciplined or placed in their proper place inside of the machine. Hope everyone's doing awesome. We're talking today about scopes. We're following up on the video that I put out this week that kind of is on brand for my releases lately that seem to be kind of on the long side for these pre-records. I try to keep those nice and brief and concise for you guys, and then to do a more expanded conversation here in grade school. But that's another one that clocked in at like 20 minutes, and kind of like our teal and orange video, I feel like only just began to scratch the surface. So maybe I'm biting off too much in these pre-records. I don't know. But regardless, we're going to have a fun hour talking about scopes, talking about the way we can use them, the way we should use them, the way you guys use them in your workflows inside of Resolve. And I'm fired up to get into it. Hopefully, while I was back there furrowing my brow and scratching my head as to why the hell technology wasn't working for me, you guys had a chance to drop some questions in the chat and to let me and Gadali know, where are you at with scopes? What do you want to know? What didn't make sense from this week's video? Where do you struggle with scopes? What questions do you have? I'll put it to you, Gadali. We got anything out there so far?
We do. Question from Andrew asking, how can you pinpoint a good standard saturation level for skin using scopes?
This is a great question. So I would love to hear anyone else's answer here in the chat if you have a feeling for that. My personal answer would be that that's not really something you can use scopes for, because like skin is something we're so sensitive to. And it's also, our perception of it is so affected by what else is in the frame, what is around the skin. So, for example, if you have a very low saturation look or mood or even palette coming from the camera negative, a little bit of like what could normally be healthy saturation in the skin can feel really garish in that context. Likewise, if you have like a really popping, like high color contrast grade, and your skin is at a more conservative pitch, it can feel sort of lifeless. So my personal take is I don't think there's much of an objective metric we can use our scopes for in that case. I'll just add to that generally speaking, like, let me flip my Resolve on here. As a very, very broad rule of thumb, I think a good one to look at. By the way, let's party for grade school today. I got these new Voyager LUTs out. I know a lot of you guys have had the chance to pick them up. I'd love to hear from any of y'all who are here today, who've had the chance to grab the Voyager Pro Pack or the Essentials Pack. How are they working out for you? Do you like them? Do you hate them? Am I an idiot? Do I know what I'm doing? Let us know in the chat. I'd love to hear about it. For today's session, I'm going to drop a couple of the components of my Voyager Pro Pack onto our timeline here, just so we've got some vibe in our images. So I'm going to go to my Pro Pack. I'm going to go to Tone. I'm going to go to Foundation. And I don't know, let's go with Orion. I think that might be my current favorite. For my modifier, I'm going to place that upstream, and I'm going to try out maybe Mira or Solaris here. Let's go with Solaris and scale it to like 65% strength. And then I'm going to go upstream of that and drop a palette LUT. By the way, for those of you guys who did grab the Voyager LUT pack in the first few days when we had it out, we've got a class coming up that we're going to be walking through how I actually use these LUTs, so we'll go into more detail on the kind of stuff that I'm doing right now. But for now, I just want to get a little bit of kind of a vibe going on here in the timeline. And yeah, what the heck? Let's go with Planet X here. I think that feels really nice. All right, so we now have a little bit of a look going on here. But I really am just dropping that in as a preamble to the point that I was going to make a moment ago, which is that generally speaking, if you're looking for a healthy level for skin tone, for me, that ends up being somewhere kind of like, if you imagine, you know, like your bullseye center down here, and then you've got your skin tone line that is sort of like crossing the target perimeter or boundary formed by, red to yellow to green to cyan to blue to magenta. So you can kind of imagine a ring or a line or a shape connecting those target points. Generally, for me, skin tone is going to live around 1/3 of the way toward that perimeter, starting at 0. Does that make sense? Again, that can really vary depending on the context of your grade, but that's a decent rule of thumb for skin saturation. So hope that's some helpful ideas there.
Question from Lester. Please explain what to look for using the histogram. I understand the basic purpose, but how do I relate it to the image and the result I'm looking to achieve?
Yeah, so good question. I think that, kind of like we talked about in this week's video, whether we're just discussing histogram, whether we're discussing scopes, I think it's more of a way of assessing what's not working than helping you find what will work, if that makes sense. So in the example that we looked at in this week's video, we happen to be looking at, when we cut from whatever that was, shot 4 to shot 5, kind of medium to a reverse shot of the exterior of that dude delivering the pizza to the lady at her house. When we looked at the vectorscope, we saw that those images didn't really stack up very well, right? In the vectorscope signal mass, that's a good way of diagnosing a problem we're probably already visually seeing, which is like, that feels a little bumpy, right? You can do the same thing with your histogram. It's more of a relative or a comparative operation where, like, if you're looking at, this shot to that shot, here's a good example of where the histogram is doing a good job of predicting what I'm seeing in the image, which is some decent flow of contrast and exposure, right? Like these feel like they're kind of in the same world. Just for the sake of example, let's say here in this shot, on my exposure node, I've got my panel's not on for the moment, so we'll do things with our mouse. In my exposure node, let's say that I had made the decision to sort of like open up the exposure and add some contrast, like so. What we might see now is, like, you see how there's less overlap between those two pieces? That's a good predictor. Before we even look at the image, that's a good predictor that the images are not going to perfectly well flow together. Now, scopes don't know a damn thing about context. So if you're cutting from, it depends on your frame contents, right? If you're looking at a backlit single with a window behind someone, and then you're cutting to a reverse of like someone huddled in a corner of that same room, the scopes probably shouldn't align super tightly. But as a general rule of thumb, when you are watching two shots cut together and you're like, that feels bumpy, that's where either the vectorscope, like we looked at in this week's video, or the histogram, as we're talking about today, can be analyzed in terms of like how the signal masses relate to each other. And they can be used to predict, like, hey, well, what if I aligned these a little bit better? And often you'll find you get better flow out of it in that case. And the other thing that I wanted to point out about the histogram while we're on the topic, well, I had something else I wanted to point out about the histogram, and it has completely slipped my mind at the moment. That's annoying. It'll come back to me. I'll circle back to that, I promise. Let's go to another question for now.
All right. Also note that your face is covering up the vectorscope.
Oh, thank you much. I'm going to move this over to there because we're going to need to see that at some point.
All right. Maurice is asking, should we be monitoring video scope levels or data scope levels? I ask because video scope levels is similar to monitoring 0 to 100 IRE on a reference monitor like a Flanders.
Oh yeah, good question. So very simple answer here. This should simply agree with whatever your video monitoring is here. So you can see in my case, I've got my levels, wherever the heck that's living. Yeah, so I'm actually at data right now, which I would, well, now I'm sort of rethinking this. I mean, let's just look, because I am monitoring video right now. And what I was going to say a moment ago is that, like, your data levels here and that data level setting in your scopes should generally agree with one another, because that's actually what's going to your monitor. So that would be the best rule of thumb, I would say, there is just to let these agree with one another. Although it's interesting, when I flip to video levels, I'm glad you asked this question, Maurice, because now I'm kind of I'm questioning my logic here, because when I look at the video levels, it's actually squishing things in, which is not what I would expect. So I'm going to revise my answer and not have a perfect explanation for why this is. But based on what I'm seeing right here, I would leave this at data, because video seems to be applying a scaling function as opposed to analyzing a different range of the signal. I know it's a little fuzzy, but that's what I'm seeing here. What I would expect is that instead of monitoring 0 to 1023, I would be looking at, whatever that video range is, which is like 100 to 900 something or other. But instead, the signal is actually being compressed in the scope. Not what I would expect, not what I want to see. So I would leave this at data regardless of what you are monitoring at. That took me a minute to find what it is, I think, a pretty clear-cut answer for now. Data levels seems to be producing the best, most meaningful measurement of what is actually happening in your image.
Dennis is asking, working in HDR, the vectorscope targets can only reach 75% rather than 100% as in SDR. What is the reason for that?
To be honest with you, I don't really know. When I look at these targets, I'll be totally honest, these don't mean a ton to me. Like we talked in this week's video about how like this is a decent predictor of gamut clipping, but for me and like the way that I grade, it's really rare for me to have values that are even hitting this 75% range that I'm at right now. And 100%, my taste is going to stop me before I get really anywhere near there. And it's also, again, kind of helpful to remember here, all of our scopes are a 2D rendering of a 3-dimensional thing. So here's a kind of fun thing that I was going to show you guys today. If I go to, I'm going to make a new node here. A really great solution if you're looking for more custom and more powerful scopes is OmniScope. I'm a big fan of OmniScope. I use it for lots of different things. Usually not for like shot level, like kind of traditional grading. I'm pretty happy with my histogram and vectorscope for that. I actually use it a lot for look dev. But the reason I'm going to pull it up right now is just as a way of sort of pointing out that the vectorscope is a 2D rendering of a 3D thing, which is the images, the pixels position within an RGB cube. So, really when we look at these targets here, we're looking at them because we're trying to find our gamut boundary. We're trying to know, okay, where is the edge of what our gamut can reproduce? But it's important to remember that like you don't have to hit these targets in order to breach your gamut. And you actually, in some cases, can hit these targets and still be in gamut, if that makes sense, because of the nature of compressing a 3D shape or a 3D piece of geometry into a 2D plane. So I would say, like, objectively assessing, am I clipping, am I safe, or am I not in a technical sense? I know that's the traditional way the vectorscope is used and the way these targets are used. That's the way I was taught to use them. I don't really use them that way. I use them more as sort of like a relative measure of how colorful I am. So kind of like we talked about in this week's video, I know that for me, even at 75%, if I've got a color that's approaching that target, I'm approaching, forget the edge of the gamut, I'm approaching the edge of what I think is good taste, if that makes sense. So why do we need it at 75% instead of 100? I don't really know. And to be honest with you, I don't actually know the relationship of these points to the gamut that we are talking about. I don't actually know how that works in a color managed context. If anyone does, I'd love to hear more. But that's what I would say is I use these targets in more of a sort of qualitative, subjective manner of just assessing how far am I taking this and how far is too far, rather than a technical thing of like, oh, I can never go here or I have to at least go there type of deal. So 75 versus 100, I think that's just a convention that, like, whichever of those you choose, it's going to be more about that than about like, oh, if I choose the right one and I always stay inside, then I know I'm safe. I don't think that's really a thing because the gamut is a more complex three-dimensional problem than the vectorscope can depict. Hope that helps.
While we're talking about Nobe Omniscope, Stiam is wondering what is the workflow for using scopes on another computer? Why do people do that? And can you show how that is set up?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the workflow and the reason for using scopes on a separate system is simply to remove the overhead of, like if you think about what your scopes are doing, they are essentially having to produce another image, if you will. They're having to analyze the data in real time and produce a graph of it, a very fairly high resolution graph, in the same way that our image is actually kind of just a high resolution graph of the pixel data. So it can impose some drag on your system. That's one reason to use separate scopes, or a separate system for scopes. The other reason is to have another GUI, another UI for that, where you can have them living in their own space, although you don't technically have to have a separate computer to have a separate display for that. And then another reason as well, another product that I've used in the past that I do like is called Scopebox. Scopebox is, again, a third-party product that allows you to tailor and customize a more robust set of scopes than you can get within Resolve, potentially. So that's something else that you can use in tandem with a separate machine. I've done it in the past using like a Mac Mini, where basically you output SDI or HDMI from your Blackmagic box and you loop it into the input of the Mac Mini or whatever machine has your scope box on it. And then you have a dedicated GUI display for that Mac Mini or whatever your scopes system is, that's giving you a separate window that's graphing all of your scopes data for you in a more custom way and not imposing any drag or overhead on the processing power of your main system. That's kind of the idea there. That's not something that I use in my practice currently. I've got a reasonably fast machine here, and I don't feel the drag of putting my scopes up and having them up when I'm grading. But that's kind of the philosophy and the idea, and how you could implement a second dedicated scopes system if you wanted to. And before we move on to our next question, I remember what I was going to point out about the histogram. I was actually going to mention it in this week's video, and I forgot then too. So here's another really good rule of thumb for how to use the histogram in a practical way, to go back to the question we were answering a few minutes ago. This is just another sort of subjective assessment that you can make. Here's what I like to think about when I'm looking at my scopes. Let's reset this exposure adjustment that I've got here, and just look at this image. Here's a good rule of thumb. So classic notion with a histogram would be well, if you've got stuff hitting close to zero and reaching toward the top of the container, you're going to have a healthy contrast ratio, right? Another thing we can point out is that can go too far when you're really hitting a wall on the left edge or a wall on the right edge. That's a good predictor that you are probably clipping data that might be preservable in a more ideal grade. Okay, so that's just kind of histogram 101. So we try to kind of keep everything in this range. You guys have heard me use my phrase before, maybe in the past, of fill but don't spill. Generally speaking, I want to try to kind of fill the dynamic range of my histogram. I just don't want to spill out over the top and bottom. Okay, so that's one kind of good guidepost. But the other thing that I like to sort of overlay on that general rule of thumb, on that consideration, is this. If you were to take the histogram, look at the signal mass of any image that you are grading. Let's just reset this for a minute. Just look at the signal mass of any image that you are grading and imagine turning this 90 degrees counterclockwise. Okay, so sort of standing it up on its end so that the low end is at the bottom and the high end is at the top. Does that make sense? Just turn it 90 degrees. When you do that and you visualize the shape that is going to result from that, is that a shape that feels like it's stable, or is that a shape that feels like you could tap it and it would topple over? You understand what I'm saying there? You want there to be weight at the bottom. You want there to be a foundation at the bottom so that in your mind's eye, when you turn that histogram signal 90 degrees counterclockwise, what it feels like is that that's a solid thing. It's certainly tall now, but you couldn't just topple it over by gently tapping on the top of it. You want it to be bottom heavy. You want it to be anchored. You want it to be weighted. And really the utility of that concept is that that's going to cause you to give what in my mind is proper weight, proper density to the bottom of the image where a huge portion of the image lives. So that's just another good practical rule of thumb that I think about a lot when I'm grading. Again, that I use more to assess what I've done than to tell me what to do. But when I'm looking at an image, and if I'm going like, gosh, that feels a little bit thin, if it's something like this, often what I'll find is when I look at the histogram, I'm like, yeah, if I turn that 90 degrees, that's not super stable. That's probable to tip over, versus if I go back to where I was a moment ago, I've got appropriate weight or foundation down there at the bottom. So just a addendum to our conversation about some more practical utility for the histogram. What else we got?
We've got both Vern and MacD asking about the parade. Can you compare the histogram versus RGB parade? And is it possible to balance in using the parade? And can you show how to do that, or do you do that?
Yeah, definitely. So first of all, if we talk about balancing using scopes, we can do that with our histogram or with the parade. And we didn't really talk much about that in this week's video. But if we look at this image is a great one because I really like the quality of it, but it's definitely very red heavy. And we can see the scopes are doing a nice job of predicting that, right? Red signal is strong, green signal is a little weaker, blue signal is quite weak, right? So before we talk about using the parade, let's just review. We could use the histogram to balance our image. I wish I had my control surface. I feel crippled without it, but I'll just use my mouse for now. We could use our histogram as a way of saying generally I want these three signal masses to sort of align with each other, right? To feel like they've got similar amplitude, similar bottom, similar top. And that is a good predictor of okay, this image indeed feels much more balanced, much more neutral than it did a moment ago, right? So we can do that with the histogram for sure. Now, regarding the RGB parade, we can do it there as well. It's, similar type of thing. When I look at this balancing operation that I've just done, I've pulled red down, and while I still may be favoring red, I'm in a better spot than I was. And this is actually going to be a really good example of kind of the limitations of being dogged about balancing to make things align in your scopes, whether that's your RGB parade or your histogram. This to me feels plenty cool already. I don't really want to cool off any further. And if I do, and I simply set myself to the task of getting my signals to align like so, I've got my peaks all aligning. Something else that you could look at would be to go now to your primaries bars and look at taking your green gain, or your green lift lower down so that it's hitting closer to where the red floor is hitting. And then same thing with the blue. Drop that way down and then go over to your gain for your blue and stretch that back upward. And, really focus on getting these three, red, green, and blue channels in the parade to align. So, that's starting to feel pretty reasonable, right? There's just one problem. This looks terrible, right? This doesn't look good at all. So I think that balancing with your scopes is it's again, something you can use more to assess what have I done or what's not working than to say oh, I know that I'm balanced when I get these things aligned. Because this to me feels entirely too magenta, entirely too blue. It just doesn't work. And if we think about why that's happening, it's because the parade doesn't know the frame contents, right? It's not reasonable. And by the way, this is how I was taught, how the colorists who I initially learned from when I began my career, I was taught, well, Cullen, if you want your image to be balanced, what you need to look for is neutral or a common floor and ceiling for your red, green, and blue channels. The problem with that argument is that the scopes don't know the contents of the frame. And to say that all frames are going to have a common red, green, and blue floor and a common red, green, and blue ceiling is ridiculous. So this to me is a great example of all right, great. I've used the parade for what it's good for, but then I've gone past that point. I'm not just using it to assess. I'm trying to have it do my job for me. And scopes are terrible colorists. I'll put it that way too. But that is generally speaking what you can use the parade successfully for, in my opinion, and also where it sort of fails. But just to summarize the successful version of it, you could look at the parade and say okay, what I'm seeing visually, which is like, that feels awfully warm. I see that well predicted in my parade. So I'm just going to move myself southeast until I feel like what I'm seeing visually, as well as what I'm seeing in the scopes, are working a bit better for me. Hope that helps.
Sean is wondering where would be the appropriate spot to place a power window in your node tree to check the skin tone on the vector scope?
Ooh, yeah, really good question. So this is going to depend a little bit on your color management pipeline. If you have your color management set up in project settings the way that we typically do here on the channel, you can go to, actually, you guys can fact check me on this. I believe we're going to see the display rendering of our pixels no matter where we place this window. Yeah, so easy answer. Literally anywhere you want when you are color managing in the way that I'm describing, using your project settings. If you're color managing in nodes, which I sometimes do in my professional practice, then you just want to make sure that you place this sort of like evaluator node downstream of your output transform node, if that makes sense. And if you don't know what the heck I'm talking about, that's okay, because you're probably not color managing in nodes, and you probably shouldn't be color managing in nodes. If your color management is happening in project settings, like it is here, like I talk about here on the channel for virtually everything we've done in the last year, you can place this sort of skin tone checker anywhere you like. And, you know, again, we've talked about this in a couple different videos, but it's a good thing, relevant thing to bring up right now. With my image sort of balanced, and again, we're looking at the, even though I'm placing this down here, we are looking at the net of the adjusted pixels. When we do this, we are seeing a good alignment to my skin tone line with my skin. So that's, to me, another good cue. In fact, a better cue in terms of what scopes can tell me that I've got a well-balanced image. Like I talked about in this week's video, but when you put this window on and you're looking at a patch of forehead or a cheek on your subject's skin, if you're seeing what you're seeing here, that's a better predictor, in my opinion, that you've got a reasonably balanced image, an image that prioritizes the most important thing, which is going to be skin. And likewise, if you are really getting a strange reading from your skin tone, like let's just say we've gone like super greeny here, like so. Oh, this is interesting. So I guess we are looking at the parallel. We're looking at this pipe pathed all the way out. So I'll revise my statement from just a moment ago and say that you want to put your qualifier downstream of your parallel stack so that you're seeing the effects of your balancing operation. Does that make sense? So in that case, you can see like, all right, either because of something I've done or not done, my skin tone is vectoring nowhere near where I would really expect it to. Again, that's a diagnostic, not a proactive thing. You don't want to necessarily use the scopes to balance, but you can use the scopes to assess balance. So in this case, I can say like, well, let's kill that and see where we're at. Okay, we're in a much better spot than we were a minute ago. And if I wanted to fuss, I could say, okay, it's skewing just a hair. Let me move this over for you guys, sorry. If I look at these scopes and this signal, that's kind of tiny. Here's another trick you can use if you want to amplify your signal. Just do a 2x zoom. This is skewing just a hair to the right of this skin tone line. This is something else you guys have heard me talk about before, like kind of pick your miss. My miss is green. If I have to skew a little green or a little magenta, which virtually every shot I am ever going to balance is going to fall a little bit left or right of that line. I'm not going to be perfect. I'm not going to bat 1,000, right? My miss, the thing that is more acceptable to me, is to be a bit more yellowy green as opposed to more like reddish magenta. I just find that to be more acceptable of a miss for my eye. So when I look at this skin tone qualifier here, I'm like, okay, we're kind of skewing where the miss right now is just a little bit magenta. So that is going to cause me to come back over to my offset. And I don't even think I can do this without my trackball, but I'm just going to gently push a little bit more green in there and then look at the result. And now we are really straddling, and if anything, just ever so slightly favoring the left side of the skin tone line now. Okay, so smattering of thoughts about how to use this sort of skin tone checker power window to your advantage, and to use it to balance things, as well as answering the original question. Placement of it should be downstream of whatever balancing that you're doing, but other than that, it doesn't really matter too much because you're going to see the fully processed image here in Resolve.
All right, Ryan is asking, can you demonstrate or describe how you would handle a white cyc job using the scopes? Any tips for achieving a perfect white background without making the image look digitally clipped?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So a couple things there is, the first thing, like you guys hear me talk all the time here on the channel about using a look. I would still use a look on that kind of job. I would just make very sure that any look I'm using doesn't have any neutrals biasing, which honestly, a lot of the looks I use tend to. We have that going on right now here in this layer. If I turn on a waveform to get a sense of or a ramp, I should say, like so. And here's actually another scope that I use for a different purpose. I use the waveform to evaluate what's happening in my tone scale. If you look at this component of my Pro Pack, there's some neutrals biasing. Shadows are going cool, highlights are going warm. Definitely something I would skip for a white cyc if you really want that cyc to be white. And I would focus my time in the look dev process, or in selecting and sort of building my look. I'd really focus on finding the optimal contrast shape, contrast curve, highlight roll off that does a really good baseline job of kind of compressing your highlights into a creamy, homogenized place, if that makes sense. Something that's going to minimize small tonal variations right out of the box before you have to do anything local at the shot level. So that would be kind of like the few guidelines I would use in setting up a project like that. And when it comes to the project itself, what you just described, actually, that's a case. Let me see if we have any sort of pertinent images here. I think the closest is probably going to be Isabella. This is actually a case. So right now I've got my palette, and I've got I'm going to turn this ramp off, and I'll leave this split tone thing off because it's not going to be my friend in this case. And I'm going to leave this contrast thing on. This is a case where I will often just use a qualifier and say like, hey, if I want my highlights to be neutral and there's nothing in my look that's going to move those highlights, I'm just going to qualify nice and soft into that highlight region, just using luminance, which we all know that's always going to be the cleanest key. If you can pull a key just with your luminance channel, that's going to be the cleanest thing you can do. So I'm just going to pull this like so. And in this case, let's say I'm trying to get like the white card over there to render very, very neutral, okay? Something like that. And in this case, sweeping just my luminance isn't quite working because I'm still leaving a lot of skin in when I do that. By the way, another thing you can do when you're doing this is to flip over to the black and white matte mode to get a better sense of what's happening. So that's not bad right there. Something like that. And what I might do, if I want to get more of that, but really not affect anything else in the frame, you could use your saturation channel. It's going to be comically low where you have to set your threshold, but just try to sort of like inch that down and get some of your, basically only affect your neutrals when you do this. This is not easy to do with a pen. I definitely wish I had my control surface working right now. So I'm going to set that high threshold, make sure to soften that out as much as possible. And, like something like this, and then all I would do is desaturate this. Now, in this case, those highlights happen to be pretty neutral already, but you can see the effect that that's having in my scope. This little sort of like divergence. Let me pop this back out for you guys. I'm going to look at this in the histogram and in the waveform. So you can see in the waveform that I've got, or actually let's go to the parade since we were talking about that. It's sort of aligning my peaks, isn't it? It's really getting those things well aligned without affecting much of the rest of the image. That's a great thing to just like kind of finesse a good range for the project you're working on. And I'll leave this on often instead of a parallel mode like this, I'll do like, I mean, this is kind of a fun exercise. I'll do this in a layer mixer, okay? So this node graph's going to look kind of crazy. But basically, if I set this like so, this is a layer mixer that I've just created. And remember, this mixer over here is a parallel mixer, which is what we typically use in my stock node graph. I'm going to tap this node, hit Command C, hit Delete to get rid of it. And now I'm going to go to the top of this, the top layer of this layer mixer, which has been set up to go over top of whatever else I'm doing in my grade in this parallel stack. Doesn't matter. Ultimately, the results of like this whole stock section of my node graph are going to feed into the lower layer of this layer mixer, okay? So now if I hit Command V to paste that node I was working on a moment ago here onto the top layer of the layer mixer, remember in Resolve, top is bottom and bottom is top when it comes to the layer mixer, this lower node takes higher visual priority. A little confusing in my opinion, but what do I know? I just work here. When we do this like so, this means no matter what else I do under this image, no matter where I swing my balance, for example, those whites are going to stay pinned where they're at least the portion of the whites that have been qualified, you know? Now, there are still limitations. You can create a weird feeling image when you're doing this, and you may find like if you're pushing it further, you actually need to qualify in a bit more of that white card. But this is something I've used on, I don't know, the last like half a dozen white psych jobs I've done before, is just take the time to finesse a nice clean qualifier that can rest over top of everything else, and that literally just has saturation set to 0, because that by definition is going to ensure those highlights remain neutral. And then just make sure that you are piping through a look that isn't biasing your neutrals any further, like at the timeline level as well. Hope that was helpful.
CM is wondering, are scopes a representation of the output color space, like Rec 709, or the timeline color space when working in DaVinci wide gamut?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. They are a representation of the final output. So we are looking not at the scene state of this signal, but at the display state, the output state of the signal. And that's a very good thing to be aware of. Because if we were seeing the scene state, we would have this vectorscope, this signal would be much weaker, and these channels would be much weaker as well. So yes, we are looking at the final processed 709, in this case, transformed image when we look at our vectorscope or at any of our scopes.
And Ryan says, in your last scopes video, there was an adjustment you made of a shot of a woman's face that clearly increased the saturation but didn't show up as extra saturation on the vectorscope. Can you show that and why it's happening?
Yeah, good catch there. That's a very good characterization of what we did in that case. And I think it was actually this shot, if memory serves. I'm going to turn this other component of our look back on here. And I'll show you a way you could do what I was describing. And really the sort of like umbrella theme of those last two examples that I made in this week's pre-recorded video were that when you do nonlinear things, the scopes are not going to predict the visual change in a very helpful way. So what was happening in that case is I was doing a variation of a sat versus sat curve, which essentially says I want to change my output saturation based on what the input saturation is. So a simple example would be something like this. I am increasing the saturation of my lowest saturations in my image while slowly tapering that effect off so that the highest saturations are not being adjusted whatsoever, you know? And actually, an even simpler way to look at this would be to look at something like the color boost knob, because that's essentially what the color boost knob is going to do. So you can see, like if I do a sort of moderate amount of color boost here, the whole signal is going to expand, but the inner core is going to expand sooner than the outer core. And we could even be even more exaggerated with this in that sat versus sat curve that I was looking at a moment ago, where we're essentially saying like, I want to affect like low medium saturations, in this case, like my subject's skin, but I really don't want to affect anything beyond that. So you can see here, and these ranges are not always super intuitive, but you can see that's a big net change in The image, if I go off and on, off, on, but in the scopes, that outer boundary is moving a little bit, but not that much. And in fact, I could even tune this so that we're really not seeing a change in this outer boundary at all. And yet we are seeing a significant change in the saturation of the image. That's a great example of, like something that the scopes just can't show us, because these are just the innermost saturations of the sort of color cube or of the signal mass. Those are being altered, but because those outer ones are not, we're really not getting a good prediction of the visual result on the scope. Like we can see a change in the scope, but if I was just to show you this scope, you wouldn't necessarily go like, oh, visually that is netting a significant change in the saturation of, for example, the subject's skin. So a great example of the limitation of a scope to sort of like properly depict nonlinear operations. And same thing with contrast. When you add like rolling contrast, using, like, for example, your custom curves here inside of Resolve, you'll see your histogram move, but it will not move in such a way, it won't really predict what you've done in a particularly useful way. So, something like that. Okay, so the net is that we've expanded contrast, but we've also added these nonlinearities to the top and bottom. The scopes are going to have limited ability to accurately predict or describe what you're seeing visually. I hope that puts a little bit more of a context to that idea.
Question from a different Ryan. When I work with a DCI projector and need to output in XYZ, I can't understand the XYZ space as I would DCI P3. Is there a way to visualize the scopes in P3 and still output XYZ?
Well, here's what I would say to that. There's no display, no projector, no display that can show anywhere near the full breadth of XYZ. So XYZ it's kind of like when this is a popular thing for delivering to Netflix or HBO or any of the streaming services right now. Everybody wants a Rec 2020 deliverable. They say, give me a Rec 2020 deliverable. Like, I mean, I can render a Rec 2020. I can target Rec 2020 in my color management, but I can't grade Rec 2020 because no monitor can produce Rec 2020. Same with XYZ. It's even worse with XYZ. So what I would say is target P3, grade in P3, let your scopes show you P3, and then when it comes time to make that render, that deliverable, if that needs to be XYZ, flip it over at that point, and you won't be able to check that your P3 rendering and your XYZ rendering are visually aligned because there is no monitor or projector that can show you that XYZ, but that was going to be the case no matter what. Now, if you're talking about a system where you have to send XYZ in order to get a proper image on the projector, that's a case of a downstream operation that's applying an XYZ to P3 transform outside of your system completely, which you simply, and like what I would want to do in that case is I'd want to say like, can we find that LUT box or that outboard piece of hardware and turn it off? I'll send the projector what it wants. The projector doesn't want XYZ. I suppose maybe it does, but you could also tell the projector, hey, you produce P3, let me send you P3. And I'll worry about, like getting it there. So that would be kind of how I would approach that, is I'd say like, well, I need to monitor P3 anyway. That's all I'm seeing. So why am if I'm rendering an XYZ deliverable, that's fine. But if it's a question of needing to output XYZ so that the monitor or the projector will display P3, I would seek to simplify that hardware pipeline if possible and say, hey, let me do any and all color managing inside of my system, and I'll send the projector what it needs in order to show what it's able to. I hope that's helpful stuff. That would be my tweak there, is just get the XYZ out of the equation, at least until it's time to generate a render, at which point you can target whatever you want because you're not going to be able to see it anyway.
Question from Isaac. When creating a gamma curve with the curves tool, I've observed through an RGB cube that it's transforming the color in a curved pattern away from the neutrals compared to a pure 1D version. Why is that?
Read that back to me once more.
When creating a gamma curve with the curves tool, I've observed through an RGB cube that it's transforming the color in a curved pattern off the neutrals compared to a pure 1D version.
I'm not 100% sure I understand the distinction between a pure 1D version versus doing it in the curves tool. I assume we're talking about the custom curves in the initial example, but the 1D version, I'm not sure. I mean, here's what I can tell you. The difference between doing a gamma hammock, if you will, I don't know why that image popped into my head right now, but doing a gamma hammock here, this is different than a gamma hammock that you might get out of like this same shape that you would see in a 3D LUT, because you're operating on a Y channel as well. So what you could do is, like this, I'll put it this way. Let's just do that, like gamma adjustment X. Let's say we love this, or this is our sort of test case. Let's grab a still of this. I'm going to turn these scopes off for a minute because it's not relevant for this particular example. And let's now go and ungang our curves and go to our Y and reset it. So now we're only looking at our red, green, and blue. Yeah, this system that's frankly not at all what I would expect. The custom curves are, they're using that Y as like a factor in a way that you normally aren't when you're grading. There we go. When I set my loom mix to 0, you can see the proper result of just directly applying gamma to red, green, and blue versus to red, green, blue, and a Y channel. So my hunch is we're talking about the distinction between operating directly on red, green, and blue versus operating on red, green, and blue plus a Y channel. But again, I don't know exactly the context of the 1D comparison example that you're making there. But that would be what I would look at there, is turning loom mix to 0 and just affecting red, green, and blue directly and seeing if that produces a result. In this case, it's a very subtle distinction between those when I wipe between them. But that's maybe part of the explanation there. To be honest, I'm not sure, but I am curious. I would love to see that example. So I hope that at least gives you some clues or a scent for further exploration.
Gene is wondering, where should one look to start understanding the math for building custom LUTs?
That's a cool question. So understanding the math for it, I'm going to give you two answers. If you're interested in building custom LUTs and building them correctly and robustly and leveraging color science appropriately, we've got some really exciting courses planned for the remainder of 2023. One course in particular that I'm excited to announce in the coming months that's very focused on that topic, because it turns out a lot of you guys are really interested in that. And as some of y'all may know, I've had my show LUT design course in the past. I've taught Creative Color Science 1, Creative Color Science 2. Lots of content out there, lots of courses that we've taught on the subject of robust look development leveraging color science. What we're going to attempt to do in this new course is to sort of take everything we've learned from putting those courses on and condense all of the best information and practices and tools and methodologies from all those courses into a single course that, actually, to go back to Gene's question, minimizes the amount of math you need to understand to do look dev. I have become a math aficionado in my 30s after snoozing all the way through high school and getting a BFA in college where they didn't teach me any math at all. I happen to love math now, but I am a firm believer that artists should not need to know extensive math in order to produce really great looking looks and like robust looks and LUTs. So if you really want to understand that math, a great place to begin is to look at coding and to look at DCTL. Specifically, I'll take a quick detour and say, if you go over into the Fusion page, I know, scary. It's time for I feel like at least once a quarter we have to go into the Fusion page. I'm just going to very quickly point out the custom tool here inside of the Fusion page. If you want to start understanding the math, this is just a tool that lets you build. It's a tool that lets you build a tool, or a node that lets you build a tool. So we're just going to build a gain tool right now. I'm going to go to my config and number N1. I'm going to say is gain, because that's what I'm going to make it do. I'm going to turn off number 2. Go to channels, and I'm going to say red equals R1 times N1, green equals green 1 times N1, blue equals B1 times N1. So at Unity, nothing's happening, but when I move my new gain wheel, I've just created a gain tool, and I've created it by applying the proper math. So now if I didn't before, I now understand that I can produce gain by multiplying my base signal by a factor that the user provides, which in this case I'm providing over here. So you can see, like, that's one very confined, simple example of something you could go crazy with. This custom tool is a great way to start to understand the math that underlies the operations of a color corrector or of a look development process, because you have to input that math directly. And as a bonus, you don't really have to do much coding. It's really just math that you have to know. So that's one avenue you could go down. And you could also definitely stay tuned for announcements about this upcoming course on robust look dev, creative color science, show LUT design, etc. that requires a minimum of a sort of like homespun math degree that I feel like I've had to put together over the last 5 or 6 years to get really good at what I do. I hope to make it a little bit easier for you guys than that. Hope that's helpful. All right, we got time for a couple more because we got a late start this morning.
Okay. Question from Sean. When running false color on set, should my input to the monitor be log?
It depends on the false color system that you're using. Some false color is really good at being scene referred and expecting a particular log input and basing the zones and the sort of painting of those zones that it does on that expectation. Some false color is really bad and it actually expects a display transformed image, at which point it's useless. Like, there is no explicit correct mid-gray in a display space. It's just wherever the display transform parks it. So in my opinion, at that point, when the whole point of false color is accuracy, it's about like, no, that's a third of a stop too dark. It needs to be here, not there. False color can't be a good enough proposition. False color has to be that, not this type of thing. So if it's in display space, which many false color systems are, in my opinion, it's useless. It defeats the whole purpose of false color. So I think it's kind of up to us as the user, or in your case as the production counterpart, to look into what false color systems are actually expecting a log image, what log image are they expecting, and then feed them that so that they give you a meaningful lens into what's exposing in the proper position of the log signal, what's exposing low, what's exposing high, where are those zones and how do they slice up, and giving you a meaningful view on that so that you can make informed and accurate exposure decisions. So it's I wish the answer was more simple than that, but the truth is that it varies tremendously and it takes a little bit of work to figure out what's a false color solution that I can actually trust. Let's do one more.
All right. Let's see. Back to scopes. How beneficial would scopes be for someone working with CGI output or other titles and such like that rather than video?
I think scopes can be just as useful in that context. In fact, I'll tell you something else that I do use scopes for a lot that we haven't really talked about much, especially for HDR grades. I use scopes to evaluate where are my titles hitting, because oftentimes what will happen is graphics vendors will provide an SDR graphic that, here, this is a good one to end on. Let me just find a sample graphic that I think I finally stashed somewhere handy here. Yeah, here we go. Let me turn my situation back on. So if we look at this graphic, we're just in SDR right now, but I've got some text that overlays here, and you can see in SDR, this graphic is actually sitting right at, it is what is forming this tooth up here on the histogram. You see what I'm talking about there? There's just that like really sharp peak right there at the very top. in SDR, that may be reasonable. In HDR, that's going to hurt your eyes if it's at the peak of the 1,000 nit container or whatever you're working in. So I use scopes all the time to evaluate where is my graphic living in terms of its peak level. And you'll just kind of have to take my word for this because we are still in SDR. But what I'll often do here is I'll say, okay, in HDR, my sweet spot for my scopes is at, say, 700. And I'm going to just gain any and all graphics, maybe without even actually color managing the graphics, because they typically don't need much more, especially if they're just white graphics. They just need to kind of be parked in the right position. And I'm just going to gain these so that they are hitting consistently on a reference position that I have selected, maybe in collaboration with my client if I'm working with them, so that the graphics are feeling proper. Now, in the case of the image that we're looking at right now, that doesn't look so hot. But if we were in HDR, this would be a pretty good spot to park white graphics in such a way that they are highly legible and they pop, but they don't make you recoil and, like have you squinting when you look at them. So that's another great way to use scopes, and that's kind of how I would use them in that titling scenario. And if you're talking about CGI renders in general, same rules apply. I think that one of the themes that we can take away from our conversation today is that the scopes are there to help you assess what you've done as opposed to telling you what to do. So in that sense, your scopes can be just as meaningful and helpful to you in the context of doing a CGI project as a live action project, because you can still start to evaluate and come up with rules of thumb like I shared at the beginning of our session today. They're like, okay, when skin is starting to reach much more than a third to 50% of the way to the outer ring of saturations here along this skin tone line, it doesn't matter if the hue is correct. That generally is something I'm not going to like the visual rendering of in broad strokes. You can start to develop those same sort of rules of thumb and feel for like, what can I learn about this image and where it's at based on the scope. No reason you can't develop that same feel for your image when you're monitoring a digitally created image through the scopes as opposed to a live action capture, because it still needs to be color managed, still needs to have a look, still needs to please your eye. So I think it can be just as useful in that context. And we looked at a good example of how you can use scopes to support you with integrating titles in a successful way as well. So that's a great place to end our conversation today. And gosh, guys, I always have fun whenever we pick off these topics. I don't know about you, but whenever I initially start with these ideas, like, okay, we're going to talk about scopes, it just doesn't feel like there's 20 minutes plus another hour of meaningful, useful conversation to be had about scopes. But I'm always surprised, whether it's scopes or something else, we always seem to find interesting things to explore and discuss, and questions that come up that I hadn't thought about before, or considerations that I hadn't thought about before. So I don't know. I guess that's a long-winded way of saying you guys are awesome, because you always show up with interesting questions and you always expand my thinking on whatever topic we're covering, however narrow or broad. So thanks for another awesome grade school. Thanks for a really fun week focusing in on scopes and on how we can cultivate an ideal relationship with them so that we can make the best images for ourselves and for our clients as possible. Thank you guys very much. I hope you have an awesome rest of your Friday, an awesome weekend, and I'm looking forward to seeing y'all next week. Thanks to Gadali for co-hosting with me.